Happy Thursday, everyone, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jamie Henkel. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at PFLAG National. As always, I am going to introduce Jean Marie Nevada, who is my teammate, my partner in crime for today's Something to Talk About Live.
Hello, Henkel. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. I have to admit, I'm thinking about this sweet potato dish I made for Thanksgiving, and it's making my mouth water just a little bit. So
I'm still weaning myself off of eating stuffing every day. It's been a hard week for me, really hard week. But we will see you in a few minutes.
Yep, have fun.
Thanks, Jamie. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she, or if you speak Spanish, ella. And we are always here every Thursday, or nearly every Thursday. We took Thanksgiving off to talk about what's going on out there. Every single week, we pick an article, we write some questions, and we invite people to come have a conversation with us. And we are really excited that you are with us today. So if you are looking to access today's article, you can visit straightforequality.org/discussion series, and you can grab that first article. And today we are going to be talking about HIV and AIDS because December 1st was World AIDS Day. And there have been some really interesting headlines going on. So just so you know, the article that we are actually using came from the New York Times. And the headline was HIV death rates fell by half, the CDC says. So to have this conversation, I would like to introduce my colleague, Greg Millett from AmFAR, to have a conversation about what's really going on. Hey, Greg.
Hey, how are you, Jean Marie?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was just listening to you guys, and I was envious about the dishes that you had for Thanksgiving. My husband and I prepared some boeuf bourguignon in a crock pot. It was fabulous.
So you were one of the non-turkey Thanksgivings.
One of the non-turkey Thanksgivings, yeah.
I'm so impressed. So many of my friends didn't do turkey. I feel like there's a whole world out there for me to discover. It's a very exciting time to be alive. But we're not talking food this time anyway. We are talking HIV and AIDS. And so, Greg, I have to admit to you, when I looked at the headline, I got really excited because a 50% decline in 8 years is a pretty significant number. But every time I see good news, I have to admit, I kind of always look for what's going on underneath it too. And I was wondering if you could help us with that. So my first question to you is, what do you think really contributed to this pretty significant drop that we saw? And what do you think are the factors that are continuing to be in play that make reducing these numbers even further so challenging?
Those are great questions. And I think a lot of people were looking at those numbers and scratching their heads and trying to figure out exactly what happened. But I'm a former CDC scientist, and I can tell you that the numbers are true that my colleagues have published. And part of the reason why we're seeing that is because a lot of people were being diagnosed earlier with HIV. If you're diagnosed earlier, it means that you are more likely to get into care earlier, to get on treatment earlier, and it drastically reduces the likelihood of people dying. And part of the reason why people were being diagnosed earlier is because CDC had this fantastic program across the United States to really just scale up HIV testing in many jurisdictions. And what that did is that it brought in people who had not necessarily been tested before or hadn't been tested in a while. And what that did is it brought in people who were tested when they were diagnosed much earlier in their disease course, which made it easier for them to treat and lower mortality rates. The other thing that changed as well is that we changed the guidelines for when we treat HIV. So beforehand, the guidelines were to treat people when they had a CD4. It's just a fancy word. It's basically clinical indicators for HIV disease. If your CD4 was higher than a certain level, then they recommended treatment. And we had that for a long time. They really got rid of that CD4 indication about 5 years ago. And now it's treat people as soon as they're diagnosed with HIV, which I think really helped because now it didn't matter if you had a better indication in terms of your disease course or a worse indication in terms of your disease course. Everybody got treated for HIV as soon as they were diagnosed. And I think that certainly contributed to lower mortality rates. Now, in terms of your second question about some of the factors that perhaps are deterring people, and some of the problems that we probably see on the horizon, especially for Black, African Americans, women, those living in rural areas. One of the things that we see is that there's always this lack of health insurance, which is a big issue in the southern U.S. It's a big issue for women, certainly for African Americans and those. And if you don't have access to health insurance, then you are less likely to be in care. You're less likely to be on antiretroviral therapy. And unfortunately, it makes you more likely to die from HIV. I think some of the other issues that we see too for those people who are not doing as well is that HIV stigma is still a real thing. We're over nearly 40 years into this epidemic, and there's still a lot of stigma that's associated with HIV. And we know that that stigma is associated with people not getting tested for HIV, or even if they are tested and they find out that they're positive, less likely to disclose their HIV status to a healthcare provider or to get into treatment for HIV. So stigma is still a big issue, and a big issue in specific communities. And then last is access to healthcare providers. So particularly in rural areas where there might be just one healthcare provider for 20, 30, 40 miles. If you don't have access to transportation, or if you are afraid of HIV stigma, going to that one provider, know somebody in your hometown, it makes it harder for people to go and be diagnosed and to get the treatment that they need. So we still have some issues. We've made great advancements, but there's still some issues that remain.
Thank you for that. And some of that was really, really fascinating stuff that I actually didn't know. May I ask a question about the CDC program that you referred to? Because you mentioned this increases in testing in certain areas that we knew that we really needed to do more work. A lot of things have happened in the past few years. Is funding for programs like that one secure? Is it safe? Is it continuing? Or is that something that we should be concerned about?
No, those programs are definitely continuing. It's great to see that CDC is continuing to innovate and to have other programs that are coming out to make sure that we continue to have these great successes like we've seen that was reported in this New York Times article. But that doesn't mean that there isn't more funding that CDC needs. CDC has been chronically underfunded when you account for inflation. That prevention really has been chronically underfunded. There's more that we need to do to invest in our prevention efforts because we'd rather prevent HIV rather than treating HIV. And that's one of the main issues now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is really, really helpful. And thinking about how the funding stream actually has to change because it is not sufficient is so important. One of the other things that came up in the article, and I've already seen somebody mention it in the chat, is about PrEP and the use of PrEP, particularly among gay men and bisexual and men who are bisexual. And the article sort of suggested that actually probably played a factor in the decline that we saw among those demographics. But it also noted that use of PrEP has actually decreased recently. Is that something that we should be looking at, something to be concerned about, and what might be going on there?
Sure. So, we're actually seeing decreases in PrEP right now, particularly over the last 8 months with COVID-19. Because of COVID-19, there are fewer people who have access to a provider during lockdown, or they're afraid to go see a provider because of a fear of becoming infected with COVID-19. And we've seen a decrease in PrEP. The other issue, of course, is the COVID-19 recession. There's so many people who have lost their jobs. And in the United States, our jobs are associated with health insurance and access to health insurance. If you don't have access to health insurance, there are some people who can't access PrEP. So all of that is contributing to some of the decline that we're seeing in PrEP. And I think the third one as well is that if you're in lockdown and if you're doing these types of virtual calls, it's very unlikely that you're meeting people or that you are hooking up or engaging in any activities where you need PrEP. So there's some people who thought, well, I'm at home, I'm alone, I'm not doing anything, so I'm just going to let my PrEP prescription just lapse for now. And once this emergency for COVID-19 is over and I'm getting back to my regular life and meeting people and friends, etc., then I can start PrEP again.
So it may not necessarily be reason for panic quite yet, that there actually are really reasonable things going on behind the scenes that explain it. Which brings us to talking about COVID, which Lord knows we can't talk about enough these days, but there's kind of an interesting conversation here. And there have been a lot of parallels drawn between the COVID pandemic and HIV and AIDS. And I know that one of the things that really got me very early on and was a good reminder of how very different it actually is was when Peter Staley posted the 2 New York Times pieces of when 100,000 people were died from AIDS, and it appeared like on page 18, and for COVID it was page 1. So there have been a lot of parallels drawn. I actually would like to talk about that a little bit. Where are those parallels between HIV, AIDS, and COVID, particularly for the LGBTQ community? And where are those differences? And what can we learn from this? I mean, I think we learned a lot about self-sufficiency and community activism, especially in the early time of AIDS. But where can we apply these things? And are there specific concerns that we should have in terms of how this is affecting our community?
Sure. Yeah. Lots of great questions that are there. And we hear this a lot. About a lot of the commonalities and similarities that we see between COVID-19 as well as HIV. In terms of the first thing that I see that's a commonality is stigmatization. So with HIV, you saw very quickly the stigmatization of people living with HIV. You might remember in the early 80s that you had the 4 H's. You had homosexuals, heroin addicts, Haitians, and hemophiliacs, all groups that were stigmatized as having greater rates of HIV. Now we're seeing stigmatization, among racial and ethnic minorities, particularly Asian Americans, where there have been all of these issues of stigma that's associated with COVID-19. So that's one of the things. The second thing is actually the degree to which racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately impacted not only by HIV, but also by COVID-19. And the fact that we still have a lot of these same underlying factors, these structural issues like access to health insurance, housing insecurity, and other issues that place people not only at risk for HIV, but also at risk for COVID-19 as well. I think the other thing that we see too that is very similar, and I've heard this among a lot of my friends, particularly in the LGBTQ community, is this PTSD that we have around COVID-19. For many of us with HIV, you can remember when people were first diagnosed, just the shock that folks went through and rippled through a lot of our friendship networks when someone was diagnosed with HIV. Now, when people are finding out that friends are being diagnosed with COVID-19, there's this PTSD that's coming back, that people remembering the first time or when they were diagnosed with HIV, that's been really difficult. And it's also difficult to see the way that manifests itself. In the years with HIV, we would see these newsletters and where hundreds of people for pages and pages, you're seeing the numbers of people who are dying within your community. We're seeing the same thing with COVID-19, where you can see in the obituaries just all of these people who are dying. So there's a lot of things that are the same. And one of them that's the biggest that's the same is this really problematic federal response that we've had for HIV, as well as for COVID-19, where the federal government really was not on top for either of these diseases, unfortunately, 40 years apart. But exactly as you said, there are also some things that are somewhat different. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that are different is the fact that, with COVID-19, we have a vaccine, or we have several vaccines that are available that are going to make a big difference with COVID-19. With HIV, we have never had an effective vaccine. The only vaccine that we've had was a vaccine that was only 30% effective. For COVID-19, we have vaccines that are over 90, 95% effective. So that's a huge difference in ending the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the other thing that's different as well is that we have the benefit of knowledge and learning from HIV to really address the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you take a look at COVID-19, we have people like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, and many others who were leaders in the HIV response. You also have advocates, like you mentioned, Peter Staley, and many others who were leaders and are leaders in the HIV response who are now lending that leadership and knowledge to COVID-19. So we're not starting from, the first home plate for COVID-19. We're actually starting at third base because there's just this benefit and wealth of knowledge on how to deal with infectious disease that's really been helping us move things along with this new epidemic.
I think it's really fascinating to think about. And I have to say, every single time you say the past 40 years, you have these moments of where you think we are now among people who have lived their whole lives with this, or most of their lives, like me, with this. And to have this moment of a very strange deja vu, and it can be a kind of frightening deja vu too. And the more you talked about it, the more I was sort of having all of those newsreels running through your head over and over again. I think it's been really an interesting experience. And I have to admit to you, I got a little bit frustrated in the beginning because I think a lot of people went to, oh, it's just like this. And I wanted to say, it's actually not just like that. There was so much more stigma on the other side of it. And in some ways, it's been so long, I think people have sometimes forgotten about how ugly it got in the beginning. So, 40 years in, like I said, there are young people who have lived their whole lives with HIV and AIDS just being a reality of the situation, or those of us who have really learned to adapt to it over the years. I sometimes get really frustrated, and I have to admit this. I feel like HIV and AIDS doesn't feel like a priority to a lot of people, especially inside of the LGBTQ community. And again, having lived through a lot of it, it's hard to accept that kind of reality. So my question to you, Greg, is what is your argument to people about why they still need to be paying attention, why this is still an urgent issue when we're talking about HIV and AIDS? And also, what should people be doing? I mean, beyond wearing a red ribbon, which I think is the easy go-to, the symbolism of it, but what should we be doing now? Because I don't feel like people are quite as engaged as they used to be when it felt so urgent, 20, 30 years ago.
Well, I think that those are great questions, and I definitely understand that frustration. I mean, HIV has really disappeared from the headlines. Take a look at even just World AIDS Day this year. There were no major networks that covered HIV or discussed HIV at all. So, I mean, I think one of the things that we have to realize is that in some ways we've been a victim of our own success. The fact that we have such effective treatments for HIV, that people are living with HIV rather than dying from HIV and living long, very healthy lives is a wonderful thing. But because of that, we're not necessarily seeing what we saw when both you and I were growing up, which was, people who had Kaposi sarcoma or had wasting syndrome or any of these other effects that were associated with HIV infection. So it's very different. In terms of what we can do and why people need to be concerned about it is because HIV is not siloed from many of the other issues that are issues for many of us who are LGBT. So for instance, there's a policy right now under the current administration about whether or not people who are in the military can serve if they're HIV positive or if they're transgender. And those are both very problematic issues. Of course, you can serve in the military if you're HIV positive. That should not be under dispute. Of course, you can serve in the military if you're transgender. That should not be under dispute. But both of those things have been happening at the same time and have been linked. We're also seeing as well the fact that, LGBTs, we have been systematically excluded from many national health surveys, US surveys. So surveys where we used to collect data routinely when I was at CDC, the NHANES survey and other population-based surveys, you're seeing that systematically LGBT populations have been taken out of those surveys. And what's problematic about that is because there's so many other health issues that we need to be following and addressing among LGBT populations with HIV that are associated with HIV, but also other health issues. And we need to make sure that we continue to advocate for those. Other things that we need to be doing that are specific for HIV is we need to inform people about the advancements that have been made in HIV. We've had so much great news that we could talk about with HIV. The fact that, people who are in HIV treatment are taking their medications and are undetectable means that they cannot transmit HIV to their partners, means that they have long, healthy lives. And there's a slogan out there called U equals U, which really helps get and educate people over the fact that if you're undetectable, that you are untransmittable. You cannot transmit HIV. And we need to make sure more Americans realize and understand that. The other thing that we need to advocate for is that there are many Americans who will not believe you if you tell them that there's a pill that you can take every day that prevents you from getting HIV. We've had PrEP for a decade. A lot of people still don't know about it. And we need to do our part to make sure that people know about it, and particularly in the LGBT community, that transgender women and particularly men who have sex with men who are Black and brown have access to PrEP. The other thing that we need to do more about as well is criminalization laws. It's crazy that there's still laws on the books in various states that criminalize people just for being HIV positive. You can move to certain parts of the country, and if you're HIV positive, you have to register as a sex offender in some places just for being HIV positive. You can go to jail for just kissing somebody. There's no chance of transmission for HIV. but just for being HIV positive. Those laws need to go, just like some of the laws that we had that criminalized LGBT sex needed to go with Bowers versus Hardwick and others. We need to do the same thing for criminalization laws for HIV. So there's still a lot of things that we need to do to really get rid of the stigma and to really advance knowledge about how much things have changed, how much the landscape has changed with HIV in terms of treatment as well as prevention.
I have to say thank you, because that was such a good list of action items, and it's literally action items. These are things that we can be advocating for, and these are things that we can change. I have one more question that sort of popped up while you were answering that last one that I just want to ask you, and it's actually about PrEP. So you mentioned a lot of people don't know about PrEP. Do you think that that is the primary issue? Is it that people don't know about PrEP, or do you think there is also a problem of, frankly, stigma around PrEP, that there is sort of this idea that if people have this, they're going to behave irresponsibly, and hence we shouldn't even be having this conversation, which is obviously an anti-sex stigma. Do you think it is mostly a lack of knowledge, or do you think that some of the social issues around it are also coming into play?
It's actually both that's taking place. And I'm glad that you asked that question, because in many ways, a lot of the medical data that comes through is usually something that we first hear about or hear more about with our providers, who we go for our regular healthcare. And one thing that you see over and over again is that there are a lot of medical providers, doctors, et cetera, who are very uncomfortable talking about sex. They're very uncomfortable talking about sexual intake, particularly LGBTQ sex. And one of the things that providers are also uncomfortable about is talking about, the specifics of HIV prevention, such as PrEP. And you see over and over again that even though doctors know about PrEP, there are some who do not prescribe it or do not want to talk about it or even recommend it against it to some of their clients. So you have to be really proactive with your healthcare provider to make sure, especially if you're LGBT, that you have access to PrEP and that you fight for access to PrEP. The other issue too is that a lot of people really genuinely just don't know about it. They haven't heard about PrEP, and they do not believe you when you tell them that this is this innovation that's been there and that we've had for well over 10 years. And unfortunately, that continues to add to a lot of the mistrust that's out there towards the medical system, the healthcare system, where people believe that the government is intentionally holding back information about HIV. So there's a lot of work for us to do.
Wow, that's just a huge issue. Thank you so much for answering that, because that's been something I've been thinking about so much. I wonder if Jamie can come back in. We have about 9 minutes left, and I saw we had a lot of conversation and questions. So Jamie, do we have some good questions in there?
We do, but I'm going to be a little bit selfish and ask the question that I have for Greg first, before I get to one that we got in the comments. And Greg, it's about PrEP, so I think we're on the right track. I was recently reading an article about how pharmacists in Colorado are going to have the ability to prescribe PrEP in the future. And I was wondering if in your work you think that is going to be more common in states around the country, and what impact do you think it might have moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And one of the things that we know about, particularly in HIV, is that the degree to which you can make access to healthcare easy enough for people makes things so much better. So sure, if people cannot make it to their clinic, but they can make it to their neighborhood CVS or Walgreens or any other type of pharmacy to get access to PrEP, that dramatically increases the number of people who are on pre-exposure prophylaxis, which of course has implications for ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic, which is a big priority for many of us, including the federal government and part of the federal government's national HIV/AIDS strategy moving forward. So yes, that's definitely something that I think is a great idea. I'm glad to see that happening. I would love to see many other places where PrEP is available. So for instance, PrEP is available in Planned Parenthood clinics, which is incredibly important, particularly for low-income women. We see over and over again that women are less likely to access PrEP compared to gay men. And that's something that we absolutely need to change. So we need to figure out other ways that we can make sure that PrEP is more available for women, particularly women who are at higher risk for HIV.
Now you briefly mentioned this campaign, but somebody was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it. Someone was wondering, do you know what the impact of campaigns like U equals U are having, and can you talk just a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, the wonderful thing about campaigns like U equals U is that it helps to reduce HIV stigma. So, once people learn more that we have these medications that are available for people who are living with HIV, that render people uninfectious, and also the likelihood that people are going to live very long, healthy, boring lives, just like everyone else. That really does a lot to reduce HIV stigma. And there are ongoing evaluations that are taking place right now around that. And you see it actually in different places like New York City and other places where instead of talking about being HIV positive or HIV negative, they talk about just being HIV neutral. It doesn't matter if you're negative or if you're positive, you follow the same patterns. You have access to specific medications that keep you healthy and keep your partners healthy. So you don't have to stigmatize people by necessarily being positive or negative. The other thing that we see too is that just access to PrEP. PrEP has been amazing in that it prevents HIV infection for populations. But the thing that a lot of us didn't realize was going to happen in the HIV community is that it's an incredible thing for anti-stigma as well. As soon as PrEP became available, and as I saw more and more of my gay and lesbian and transgender friends taking PrEP, a lot of friends who beforehand would never have considered dating somebody who was living with HIV, all of a sudden they're booed up with their partner who's HIV positive and there's no problem. They're like, yeah, this is great. I love it. So it's been this amazing anti-stigma thing that's taken place too, where people know that they can protect themselves. They know that there's very little chance, if any chance, no chance at all of getting HIV if they're taking PrEP and if their partner is on antiretroviral therapy. And it's completely changed the conversation. It's completely changed the landscape in terms of stigma, particularly in the LGBT community, and it's been wonderful to see that.
Now, I'm guessing that I know the answer to this question, but I'd love to hear, what do you think about the idea of harm reduction as a tool for minimizing exposure, as opposed to the sort of hard abstinence messages that a lot of people are getting about HIV and about COVID?
Sure. So for the uninitiated, harm reduction is basically, it's ideology of meeting people where they are. So instead of saying, no, you cannot have sex, or no, you can't participate in drug use, really meeting people where they are and saying, well, here's some of the things that we can do to protect you if you want to engage in these particular types of activities. So for drug use, particularly injection drug use, one of the most famous harm reduction activities that we see are needle exchange programs or syringe exchange programs. And that's something that's really important because we know that if people are involved in syringe exchange programs, that they have their needles clean, they're less likely to get HIV because their needles are clean. Plus, it gives them access to drug treatment if they want to get into drug treatment. You see the same thing as well for HIV, where harm reduction is there, particularly now during the COVID-19 pandemic, where groups are coming out and saying, well, if you want to think about safer sex with COVID-19, here are the different ways that you can do it. It's always best to give people options for different types of activities rather than saying a hard no or a hard yes, because you want to make sure that people are as informed as possible about what the risks are, as informed as possible about what types of activities they could do to prevent themselves, to make sure that they can actually prevent themselves, and to also make sure that others know about that as well.
Kind of like the old, the more you know. It literally comes down to the more you know, the better off you are.
Absolutely.
Now, I think this is going to be a quick answer, I hope, but this is something I had never heard, so I'm going to ask the question. Somebody was wondering, they'd seen disclaimers about PrEP being not as effective or not being proven for bodies born female. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely false. So PrEP works perfectly well for both men who, people who are born male or people who are born female. It works well for transgender communities as well. And not only is PrEP just as effective in each one of these communities, particularly the daily oral PrEP, the pill that you take every day, but there was amazing news that just came out 2 weeks ago that showed that injectable PrEP is just as effective in men, women, as well as transgender populations as well. And what's amazing about that is that, for those people who don't want to take a pill every day, with injectable PrEP, you could actually just take an injection and you'll be protected against HIV for as long as 3 months. They're now looking at pills that can be used with birth control where women can be protected for as long as a year. So there's just incredible technologies that are out there on the horizon that we want to make sure that everyone in the LGBT community can avail themselves of.
Thank you for that. But I do think that brings us to time. Jean Marie's got to take us away. So thank you so much, Greg. And Jean Marie, I will see you next week.
Yes, and Greg, thank you so much for being with us. You are incredible, and this was such an informative and an interesting conversation. So I really appreciate you and everything that you are doing. Please come back and visit us again.
Looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to Thanksgiving with both of you next year as well.
Oh my gosh, we're all in. We'll be together. Thanks, Greg.
Okay.
Well, everybody, that brings us to the end of another show, and we will be back again next week. I hope you enjoyed this. Next week, we're going to be talking about the film Cured, which you definitely should look up. It's an incredible piece of LGBTQ history that has not been told enough, and we're going to have some really great guests for that. So we are going to end the way we end every single week, advising you to run fast, to laugh hard, and to most of all, be kind. And as usual, and as we say every single week, please continue to wear your mask because it saves lives. My name is Jean Marie Navetta. I am from PFLAG. You can learn more about us by visiting pflag.org, and we will see you back next week on Something to Talk About Live.